Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. As said, I'm going to present microarchitectural attacks on RISC-V hardware CPUs, and this is joint work with my wonderful colleagues at CISPA. So when we started the work, we had one research question in mind, which was like, how basically does the microarchitecture attack surface on RISC-V CPUs differ from what we already know on x86 or on ARM? And what is the impact of that difference that we have on attacks and defenses as well on RISC-V? So after we thought about that thoroughly, we came up with a few challenges that you need to solve before you can actually proceed with doing attacks on RISC-V. So the first one, the first problem is that on x86, the root of many microarchitecture attacks is the cache, right? And on RISC, you have no documented, unprivileged cache flushing instructions, so your control over the cache is in some sense very limited. And the RISC-V standard does not mandate these instructions, right? Additionally, there's problems with timers, so you basically also don't have mandated timer resolutions in the RISC-V standards, and as we know, timers with low granularity make exploitation of microarchitecture attacks much more difficult. And then we also had the third question, that is, well, what are the difference we have when we have different performance optimizations that are specific to RISC-V and different performance monitoring interfaces in the way of performance counters and so on that we only get on RISC-V and that we don't get on other microarchitectures. What can we do with that for microarchitectural attacks? And our findings were quite interesting. You see here basically a simple diagram of a RISC-V core. And we found here that these processors exhibit similar problems in behavior than the ones we've seen on x86 or ARM. But we also interestingly found three new attack techniques, which I'm going to present here. And these attack techniques relate to very much to the way that a RISC-V processor is structured and is different to an x86 processor. And these are mainly cache and time, flush and fault, and cycle drift. And we're going to jump right into these three new primitives with cache and time. And cache and time is basically a new side channel on the instruction cache. And it's different to stuff that we've seen previously in that it doesn't require shared memory, and it also has cache line granularity, right? Before we've seen attacks that have both these points, right? That where you can get the cache line granularity, or where you need shared memory, but not this join thing, right? And the primitive that we found that enabled this was a form of limited speculation. That is, that RISC cores basically prefetch instructions on branches, and then we found out that even with this limited speculation, so the RISC cores we analyzed don't support full speculation, they don't execute speculatively, you still get a way to exploit these cores. So let's look at the details. So basically on the right we have a code that has a secret-dependent branch. This is a very common attack scenario, and what we basically want to do is we want to infer the branch direction in the secret, depending on the secret, right? And what we do is we first use an instruction which is called fence-i that only exists on RISC-V, and this instruction is used to perform synchronization, but on all the cores we observed it's just implemented as a plain iCache flush. So this instruction flushes the entire iCache. So if you execute that, everything on the right side is out of the iCache, right? Then we basically find a prefetch gadget that selectively allows us to prefetch one of the branches that the victim can take. And we mistrain that gadget, execute it, and at this point this B branch that you see here is in the cache, right? And now we can time the victim, and because only one of the two branches is in the cache, right, we can extract the secret. And then we basically run our attack, right? We can see which of the two branches was taken, and we get the secret as a result, right? So the next attack is called flush and fault. And this attack is specific to RISC-V because on some RISC-V processors that we analyzed, you have a completely separated D and I cache hierarchy, right? So the trick that we know from x86, where you do the traditional flush and reload and you just perform a memory load, doesn't work anymore, right? You need basically a new way to probe the I cache, and that is where flush and fault comes in, where we build basically a very generic primitive that you can use on all RISC processors that enables flush and reload based attacks on the I cache. So how does that work? Again, we begin with the candidate we've seen before, the fence I instruction. It empties the entire I cache for us, which is very nice. And then we basically do it a different way around now. We assume that the victim has already executed, yeah? So we say, for example, that the branch A is already cached. And then we basically time a jump that contains a victim to a location that contains a victim cache line. And the nice thing that we do is we jump in a way that this jump triggers a fault which we can handle, right? So we either jump into unaligned instructions or we just control the state before the jump so that instructions that we jump to provoke an error. Then we handle that fault, and by timing this fault, we basically immediately leak the secret again. So now we have a very generic primitive again, and even though the caches are completely split, we can still probe the I cache. Yeah. So the last gadget is called Cycle Drift, and it relates to performance monitoring interfaces on RISC-V. So the RISC-V standard mandates something that is similar to RDCSP on x86. So we have the RD cycle instruction that gives us the elapsed cycles since the core boot. And we also have another very attacker-friendly instruction, I would say, which is RDinstRed, and that gives us the retired instructions since the core boot. So this is especially problematic because it's very low noise, right? Most instructions take one cycle, doesn't depend on scheduling suddenly anymore, so you get a very deterministic side channel there. But it gets even worse, so you can combine both of these instructions and basically see how they drift apart, right? That's why it's called cycle drift. And if you observe that, then suddenly you have the case that when you have multi-cycle instructions, for example, a multiplication, you can observe whether there was such a multi-cycle instruction. You might ask, why is this relevant? Well, there's people who basically try to pad their cryptographic implementations with instructions, and they say, well, as long as it has the same timing latency, that's no problem, but suddenly it becomes a problem, right? When you can observe how many instructions retired. And it gets even worse. There's security boundaries on RISC, and then there's the so-called machine mode, which is the lowest security boundary, and we verified that, well, these counters don't stop if you switch to machine mode, yeah, and they don't get reset. So basically you can monitor stuff in machine mode with really, really deterministic and noise-free side channels. So building on this, we did a few case studies. So because we had this wonderful instruction side channel, we were able to break KSLR with 100% accuracy. We bypassed branch shadowing mitigations. We also were able to leak the presence of inaccessible files on the file system via the amount of retired instructions. We detected interrupts also again with very, very high precision because of the instruction counters. And then we also have standard benchmarking attacks, I would say, an attack on AES-T table and an attack on a square and multiply RSA implementation. And you're going to see some results of that. And on the left, you see the KSLR break on the top with timing, which looks kind of noisy, right? And on the bottom, you see the same KSLR break with retired instructions, which suddenly becomes very, very deterministic, right? On the right side, next to it, you have interrupt detection, where you can also very nicely see how the interrupts basically induce these downward peaks and can be detected easily. And on the right, you see an AES T-table attack, which we performed with flush and reload, evict and reload, and prime and probe. And all of these were super deterministic and worked even better than on x86 processors. So what is the takeaway? Basically, we have very similar challenges to the x86 world on RISC-V. But what is kind of disheartening is that even though we have a lot of theoretical mitigations and hardware designs that should work on RISC-V, none of them were implemented in the processors we tested. So the result is, I think, that we need more security research on RISC-V, that we need to look deeper into these new processors, especially when they're becoming popular now, that we can get rid of such issues at an early stage. Yeah. So if you're interested, you can look at our artifacts. It's all open source, or contact me for more infos. Thank you very much.
Very much, Lukas. We have time for questions.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. So it's a bit unclear to me if these vulnerabilities arise inherently from the standard or from maybe simplistic implementations. So which processor exactly did you test? Or
Exactly. So we tested basically the two cores that were available at the time and that are, I think, also mostly covering the market now, which is the U74 from Sci5 and the C906 from Allwinner. And these are both the cores that are like the most sophisticated, I would say, at the time. Yeah, they run a full Linux system, so they're quite beefy cores, I would say, for RISC-V. And to the question whether it's the implementation or the standard, I would say it's a mix of both, right? With RISC, you can basically, the standard has mistakes. Like I would say it's a problem, for example, that you can see the retired instructions. That's an oversight, I would say.
I also had a question on that. Can you see the retired instruction from user mode?
Yes. And you can see the retired instructions from user mode that execute in machine mode. So basically, you see the retired instructions on the entire system. There's no...
This is because the standard does not say that it should be reset. So it remains open.
It remains open. The standard allows you to do that, but manufacturers don't do it. And that's the problem, basically. You have on one side the standard, which leaves the ton open. And then the manufacturers, of course, also implement their own stuff. For example, there's also RISC chips which support cache flushing, which is not in the standard. But manufacturers say, well, it's a nice thing to have for performance, so we implement that, right?
Okay. Thank you.
So did you find any reason why this counter is exposed to, you talked about, exposed to not just user but also kernel mode as an instruction as opposed to something like a performance counter that's...
So that's again, I think that relates to the standard. So the standard says basically you should expose this counter everywhere, right? So the standard says this instruction, retired instruction counter, you want to have it everywhere, or you should have it everywhere. That's mandated by the standard. The part where basically you can count instructions over these security boundaries, that's obviously not mandated by the standard, but it seems that vendors do it because it's probably the easiest way to implement the counter.
So does RISC-V not have something like performance counters that usually does that, or?
Yeah, so RISC-V has performance counters. You have basically variable performance counters, and then you have two mandated performance counters, or basically three. One is a low-resolution timer, one is a high-resolution timer, one is the retired instructions.
So there's no given reason why this in particular needs to be an instruction at all?
No. Okay, now I get what you mean. Basically, there is this instruction, and there's also a register which you can read, and the RISC-V standard basically mandates that both of these do the same thing.
Thanks.
Okay. So let's thank Lukas again for a nice talk.
Thank you very much.